We've got Andy in Pennsylvania. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. How are you?
Hi, Andy. We're good.
Hi. I just want to say I've really enjoyed your show. I am a Christian who's kind of been thinking lately, and I've really enjoyed the perspective that you guys give and the logic you present and everything. And it's been very good for me, just kind of how I think through things. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
The question I had for you was something that struck me the other day. I agree with you, on your points that you make sometimes when you talk about, is God moral, or is, God can't be because he's not moral, because the slavery thing and other, points, like the slaughtering of Canaanites and all that sort of thing.
I got to interrupt because it sounded like you were saying that we said God can't exist because God is immoral.
I don't think he said that.
Yeah, maybe that's not phrasing it right, but the feeling I come away with is, I kind of feel like all I have to do is prove God's not moral, and that means there's no God.
Oh,
At least there's no Christian God.
No. What you would have to do is say that this God is purported to be moral, and can be, and its actions that attribute to it are shown to be immoral, and that raises a conflict
on that particular God.
On that particular
but yeah,
definition.
you're correct. There's something called the problem of evil, and I usually will say, I may not say it 100% of the time, but usually when I bring it up, I point out that the point of problem of evil is not to demonstrate a God does not exist. It just demonstrates that God does not have the properties of being all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-benevolent.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that kind of takes my talking point away then, because my question was going to be basically what. And this came from I watch a lot of these debates, like the big atheist guys, Rick Dawkins and all those guys online and everything, and Harris and those guys. And my thinking was, the argument that I hear some make is that, well, maybe God thinks that something is moral that I don't. Like maybe he thinks it was good to kill a child, and it's kind of like, well, even if I disagree with that, I feel that actually, am I any further along in deciding whether he's there or not? Because does that really matter? I mean, maybe he just views things differently than I do.
Yeah, or maybe he's just a really evil God that likes to torture children.
Yeah, the question of whether God exists is separate from assessing particular definitions and descriptions of God. If someone is saying that God is perfectly moral, and that God commands that it's okay to own people as property and to run around slaughtering, innocents, those two things are in conflict, and either one of those things has to go. I don't believe in God because there hasn't been sufficient evidence to support the claim. I remain unconvinced that any God being exists.
Right. Well, this wasn't my purpose for calling, but can I ask you one quick follow-up question to that point then?
Sure.
It is, and this is something else I've kind of thought about lately, is how do I approach this question? Because I know based on listening to you, I take it that you kind of approach it from, we're starting with a zero, like there's no God, no assumptions about anything, and you make a claim, you tell me what your support is for that. And then the question, though, is that because, a God situation, you may never be able to 100% prove something.
Okay.
So is it more appropriate to say, okay, I'm going to assume nothing and only believe what I can prove, kind of the scientific approach? Or do I say, I'm going to look at all the options, and whichever one seems most likely, I'm going to go with it?
Well, let me ask you this. Now, here's something that I sometimes bring up to people. We're very, very fortunate to have the luxury of not having to believe things without sufficient evidence. Most times in our lives, we're not pressed to make big life-altering decisions without sufficient evidence, right? There's sometimes when we do, and we like to sometimes use the jury trial example. And I always say that is the worst position to ever be in, to have to make a decision about what you think happened. When you're given limited evidence, it might actually even be limited by law. Like maybe there's other evidence that could change your mind, but you're not even allowed to see it, right? For some reason. Right. It was illegally obtained or something. So you don't even know that what you're seeing is the full body of evidence or all the evidence that might convince you. And you're asked to make a decision about someone's innocence or guilt in a situation where people's lives might be on the line. That is a horrible, horrible situation for people to have to be in. Anytime you have to make a decision and there is insufficient evidence and you are forced to decide, that is a horrible situation to be in. My question is, if you weren't put in that situation by something like a courtroom, why would you put yourself in that situation?
Well, I think it's just because of for me, it's because of the implications. I mean, and I completely agree with your point because I've also thought the same thing. It's like I have the luxury of having more information at my fingertips than most people throughout history have. I mean, what if I was like a serf in 7th century England who lived to be 30 years old and never had schooling at all? So,
but what are the implications?
Make any of these decisions?
What are the implications So I'm not saying that you don't have to, that there's not compelling cases with which to make some sort of decision. There's two problems here on the God thing. Number one, I have seen insufficient evidence to warrant a conclusion that a God exists, or that a God could possibly exist, or likely to exist, or is more likely than an alternative. And yet you seem to think that God is more likely than an alternative based on information. So we're already on different footing there. But this isn't just, either a God exists or doesn't. You talked about the potential consequences. Well, which consequences? Because, for example, if you're worried about your afterlife, well, that's only a consequence. That's only a consequence.
I'm thinking about,
That's only a consequence. That's only a consequence.
If there's an afterlife.
If you presuppose that there's an afterlife. Yeah. What reason do you have to think there's an afterlife?
I guess just because that's what I've always been told.
Yeah. And so if it turns out that this life, which we know we have, is the one and only life, then it would seem to me that the better way to make decisions would be to make decisions that affect this life and not some proposed afterlife. Because if you go down that route, are you trying to find your way into the best heaven or avoid the worst hell?
Right. No, I see what you're saying.
I always use the threat of hell and afterlife, especially a negative afterlife, as that sort of, I describe it as somebody on a used car lot, right? And you're buying a car, and the guy says, I want to get you in this car today. And you say, you know what, I'm going to go home and think about it. And he says, well, we've had 3 couples in here already looking at this car. In fact, I think one of them might be in the back talking to my manager about it right now, trying to make a deal. So they put this pressure on you, right? So it's like, here's this decision that you really aren't, you wouldn't think of as a pressured decision. You'd like to take your time because you're going to put thousands of dollars down on this, or potentially tens of thousands of dollars. And so you're saying, I need to think about it. But then they say, well, let me add some pressure here to sort of force you to make this decision. And I look at that as like the religious paradigm, right? They give you this God, and then they say this is such a big question. Who is it? McAllister, right? There's an apologist named McAllister, and he says this is one of the big questions. I'm like, this is not a big question. People don't walk around day in and day out wondering if there's a God. They're wondering, how do I pay my mortgage? What if I get fired? What am I making for dinner tonight? What's wrong with my baby? Why is
What if I come up with a disease that's going to bankrupt me?
Yeah, so people are not thinking, it is not a big life question whether or not a God exists. But then what they do is they throw down hell in an attempt to try to make it a big question. We're going to make this an important question by building this afterlife and telling you it could be horrible for you forever. And so you have only your lifetime to decide. And what if you die tomorrow and then you didn't decide and then it's too late because you didn't believe? And so this is just them basically saying, we have another couple looking at this car. Right? This is the pressure tactic to get you to tell you that you have to make the decision.
What if you die tonight and there is an afterlife? And the criteria is whether or not you were gullible enough to believe in some afterlife without sufficient evidence.
What do you mean?
He's asking, what if that's the filter? That if you believed it and there wasn't sufficient evidence, then you go to hell.
Yeah, what if this is a test on whether or not you are especially gullible?
Whether I would swallow it hook, line, and sinker. I guess then I'm in another bad spot.
Yeah.
But it's funny that you said that though, because that's actually, I was talking to my mom about this process I'm in right now, and that's one of the things she pulled out is, what if you're wrong? What about Pascal and the whole thing?
Yeah.
So I mean,
Pascal is awful. I look at that, and the thing that gets me is they try to portray it as, if you believe and it's wrong, what have you lost? And I'll tell you what, when I was a devoted Christian, I had my whole life sunk into that religion. I mean, if I'd have kept on with that until the day I died, I would have lost my entire life to it. So it's a bunch of crap when they say, if you believe and you're wrong, it's nothing. It's just like the first caller we had. You may not have been able to hear that call, but there was a caller that called first. And basically, he's faking believing to please his family. It means he's going to church every Sunday. This is a person who's investing, and he doesn't even believe. But it's like, if you... So, and this is just to show that if you actually did believe it and you said, I'm going to devote myself, you bet you're going to be putting time and resource, money, time, energy, effort into this, trying to convince other people, doing what you think God wants you to do, praying for guidance, and then letting weird little intuitions rule your life and which job you take and who you marry and whether or not you adopt this child. There are people who have huge life decisions based on these things that they believe about their religion. It's gigantic. The cost
like whether or not we take our kid to a doctor or
I've made
pray.
those types of decisions myself.
Yeah. So it's not no cost to you if you believe in it and it's not true. There's a huge cost if you believe it and it's not true. You've basically given your life over to something that is incorrect.
Well, yeah, that's the cost. It's one of the many costs.
It's huge.
If you believe it and it's not true, that means you spent your entire life believing a lie, which prevented you from accessing what is actually true about reality.
But also devoting yourself to that and letting it guide your life.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right.
Instead of owning and living your own life.
I completely agree. Because, one of the things, and this is the last thing I'll say because I know there's probably not much time left, but one of the things that's interesting is, one of the Christian things, they always say, well, if you believe, you'll truly be free. The truth will set you free. But I personally kind of think, I'm actually, if I didn't believe, I'll be more free because I can kind of just feel okay, I'm free to pursue what I want and not have the constant thing, constantly asking myself, well, is this what I should be doing? And always having that kind of hanging over my head.
Yeah, you're not having to double check all the time to see what you're supposed to want. And what you're supposed to have for your life. But the thing is, if you go off and do that, you're the evil sinner that just doesn't want to be responsible to God.
Yeah, the example that I've used before, when I talk to college students, which would make you happier? To have the state assign you your major and your job? To have your parents decide your major and your job and who you marry? We would rebel against those choices and being made for us in almost every other circumstance, and yet religions, particularly Christianity, have this idea that God has a plan for your life, and if you're not living up to God's plan, you are a failure. And that is that is abuse.
But more importantly to me is, when did it become a sign of being personally irresponsible to say that you want to take responsibility for your own life?
Yeah.
Seriously, is that not backward?
Yeah. It does seem that way. Yeah.
Hand your life over to God and you're taking responsibility.
Yep.
That's just assigning it off to somebody else.
Yeah.
Something else.
Just fill in the blank.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, thank you guys very much for everything you do. I appreciate it. Appreciate your show and your thoughts and everything. And please keep at it.
Thanks, you for
Andy.
your call.
Appreciate it.
Yep. Goodbye.
Yep.
He said, "You got in a goodbye."
Yeah, I just didn't want to hang up on him beforehand, but.